This war did not have to happen, and understanding this fact changes everything we know about it. The conflict we see today wasn't some inevitable chain of events that could have been prevented. The seeds of this war were planted years ago, and it didn't suddenly emerge in 2022. The truth is, it started much earlier as a confrontation between two major powers, the United States and Russia. The battle played out on the stage of Ukraine, a nation caught in the middle of a power struggle that wasn't really about Ukraine at all. At its core, the driving force behind the conflict was the U.S. desire to expand NATO eastward all the way to Ukraine, despite Russia's repeated and public objections. To understand the root cause of the war, let's start with this simple but crucial question. Would the United States tolerate a hostile military alliance moving directly to its border? The answer is clear. Absolutely not. Just like Russia's resistance to NATO in Ukraine, the U.S. would never accept foreign military forces or alliances positioned in Mexico or anywhere close to American territory. If the U.S. had been more strategic and mindful of global power dynamics, this entire war might never have happened. The situation didn't blow up out of nowhere in 2022. It traces back to 2014, when the United States played a key role in helping to topple Ukraine's government through what could be called a regime change operation. This was the real starting point. From then on, Ukraine was set on a path of instability and conflict, making diplomacy more critical than ever. Unfortunately, that opportunity was repeatedly missed. By the time the Russian invasion of 2022 took place, the war wasn't just starting, it was escalating, with deep roots reaching back nearly 8 years. Before that escalation, President Putin had presented security proposals to the United States, proposals that could have resolved the crisis without military action. However, the Biden administration refused to negotiate. This refusal stands as one of the most critical mistakes in this entire conflict. If those talks had been embraced, perhaps we could have avoided much of the destruction that followed. Even after Russia escalated the conflict in February 2022, there was still a genuine opportunity to end the war quickly. This wasn't a situation where victory was inevitable on either side. Russia's core demand was simple and clear: Ukrainian neutrality and a formal commitment not to join NATO. Surprisingly, Ukraine itself was willing to acknowledge this need. President Zelensky publicly stated that Ukraine was ready to accept neutrality. This was not just a theoretical concession. Ukraine was acknowledging a reality that could have de-escalated the entire situation. In early 2022, Russia and Ukraine came close to agreeing on a framework for peace. Delegations from both sides met in Istanbul, where they worked through the details of an agreement. By April 2022, the framework had largely been finalized. The agreement addressed key issues such as neutrality, security guarantees, and an end to hostilities. At that moment, diplomacy had the power to save countless lives and prevent further destruction. However, just as the agreement was within reach, the situation took a turn for the worse. The United States and the United Kingdom intervened, urging Ukraine to reject the agreement. They assured Ukraine that it did not need to accept neutrality and that Western support would continue. The message was clear: keep fighting. And so, Ukraine was pushed to continue a war that could have ended months earlier, all under the assumption that more support from the West would lead to a different outcome. This decision was catastrophic. Since then, hundreds of thousands of people have died and many more have been injured. The war, which could have ended swiftly, dragged on, with Ukraine serving as the battleground for larger powers. The cost has been staggering, not only in human lives but also in national resources and global stability. As the war continued, the consequences of rejecting the peace deal in 2022 became more and more apparent. What started as a potential path to a diplomatic resolution has now turned into an endless cycle of destruction and suffering. The decision to keep fighting, despite the offer of peace, has led to the loss of more lives, the devastation of Ukraine's infrastructure, and the exhaustion of its people. Ukraine, once a thriving nation, is now a shell of its former self, caught in a proxy war that has drained its resources and morale. In the aftermath of the failed peace talks, the balance of power on the battlefield shifted. Russia, having advanced militarily, gained ground and strengthened its position. The territory it controls, including parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, has become a key issue in the ongoing negotiations. Yet, despite Russia's military gains, the core issues that caused the war in the first place, NATO expansion and Ukraine's neutrality, remain unresolved. What is especially troubling now is the fact that many of the proposals being discussed today are not radically different from what was on the table in April 2022. The fundamental elements recognizing Ukraine's neutrality, acknowledging Russian control over occupied territories, and ensuring that Ukraine does not engage in military actions against Russia are still central to any potential settlement. However, what was once a possible peace agreement is now being presented in a much more difficult context. The war has lasted longer, and the cost is higher. The key difference now is that Ukraine is in a far worse position to negotiate. Its people are exhausted, and its leadership, under martial law, faces both internal and external pressures. Despite the public statements of Ukrainian officials, the people of Ukraine, by most credible indicators, want peace. The toll of the war is too great, and the promise of NATO membership no longer holds the same appeal it once did. Yet, the leadership in Kyiv seems willing to continue fighting as long as foreign support continues to flow. As the war drags on, it becomes increasingly clear that the conflict is no longer about achieving military victory, but about political survival and maintaining a strategy that has already failed. The United States, which has provided massive financial and military support to Ukraine, has a critical role in determining the outcome. If Washington chooses to continue backing Ukraine without any clear end in sight, the war will persist, and so too will the suffering. However, if the U.S. were to shift its stance and communicate a clear message to Europe and Ukraine, one that signals the end of American involvement, the war could end almost immediately. This is a critical juncture, and the decision is in the hands of U.S. leadership. The truth is that Europe, despite its vocal support for Ukraine, is not equipped to sustain this war on its own. European militaries are stretched thin, and their stockpiles of critical weapons and ammunition are running low. While European leaders continue to project confidence, there is little public support for further escalation. The citizens of Europe are weary, facing economic hardship, inflation, and growing discontent with their governments. The appetite for a prolonged war in Ukraine is diminishing, and the political pressure is mounting. Without U.S. support, Ukraine would face an insurmountable challenge. Its military is exhausted, and the country is rapidly losing both territory and manpower. The myth that Ukraine can continue fighting indefinitely without foreign backing is just that, a myth. The reality is that without continued American assistance, Russia would gain even more ground. The war would not simply freeze at current battle lines, it would escalate, potentially leading to a situation much worse than a negotiated settlement today. At this critical moment, European leaders, despite their rhetoric, may soon be forced to confront the truth. Without American backing, their commitment to Ukraine is hollow. This is the uncomfortable reality that both the U.S. and Europe must face. The war cannot continue without the United States, and it cannot be won without a serious shift in policy. While the war continues to drain Ukraine, Europe, and the United States, it's becoming evident that there are powerful forces behind the scenes that benefit from its continuation. These forces, often linked to the military-industrial complex, are profiting from the war's persistence, creating a situation where the interests of a few outweigh the suffering of many. Defense contractors, arms manufacturers, and the associated political networks have a vested interest in keeping the conflict alive, as it provides them with profits and power. These groups are lobbying in both Washington and European capitals to prolong the war, regardless of its human and strategic costs. This is not a new dynamic. History has seen similar patterns before, most notably during the Vietnam War, where political leaders and military leaders refused to admit defeat, instead perpetuating the war for years, even after it was clear that the goals were unattainable. We are seeing a similar pattern now in Ukraine, with a conflict that, while far from over, has already turned into a strategic disaster for the West. Instead of reassessing and negotiating for peace, policymakers continue to double down, hoping that more sanctions, more arms shipments, and more pressure will force Russia to capitulate. But this strategy has already failed. Russia's economy hasn't collapsed under sanctions, and the military aid provided to Ukraine hasn't delivered victory. All it has done is prolong the bloodshed. The current state of the war isn't just the result of strategic miscalculations, it's also driven by political inertia. Leaders in the US and Europe are reluctant to admit that their policies have led to a dead end, preferring instead to promise future success and victory, even as the situation deteriorates. The stakes for these leaders are political survival and legacy. It's easier to continue pushing a failing policy than to confront the uncomfortable reality of failure. The tragic irony is that, just like Vietnam, the war continues to rage, not because it's winnable, but because it's politically expedient for those in power. The people who suffer the most in this situation are the Ukrainians, who are being sacrificed in a war that is no longer serving any clear purpose. And yet, the political elites in Washington and Europe continue to push the narrative that they're fighting for democracy and freedom. Meanwhile, the real interests driving the war remain obscured interests tied to profit, political power, and the preservation of an untenable strategy. The reality now is stark. This war could end, but it requires a fundamental shift in policy, and it requires the leadership to confront uncomfortable truths. The war in Ukraine is a tragic example of how strategic miscalculations, political pride, and vested interests can escalate a conflict far beyond its original scope. However, despite the extensive damage, there is still a clear path to peace. The United States, with its unparalleled leverage, has the power to bring this war to a close by simply making one decision: to withdraw its support for Ukraine and stop arming and funding the conflict. If Washington were to make this decision, the war would immediately lose its most important lifeline. For Europe, the reality is that without U.S. support, the war cannot be sustained. The European leaders who continue to advocate for prolonging the conflict are increasingly isolated from the reality on the ground. Their own people are exhausted, their economies are suffering, and the military resources needed to continue the fight are running out. Europe simply cannot continue this war without the U.S. Without American support, Russia's position on the battlefield would solidify, and Ukraine would continue to lose ground. The Ukrainian people, who have endured unimaginable hardship, are reaching the breaking point. Many Ukrainians, though often unheard in the media, are desperate for peace. They do not want to continue a war with no clear end, no clear victory, and no clear path to rebuilding their lives. This war, though framed as a struggle for democracy, has become a war of attrition, a war that serves no one but the elites in Washington and Brussels, who continue to profit from it. The truth is, this war was avoidable. It could have been stopped at multiple points along the way, but each opportunity was missed. Now, the cost of delay is higher than ever, and the longer the war continues, the greater the devastation. Ending this conflict will not be a sign of weakness or defeat. It will be a recognition of reality, a willingness to confront past mistakes, and a chance to build a better future for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world. The responsibility now lies with those in power, the U.S. leadership, European leaders, and the Ukrainian government, to take the necessary steps to end the war. They have the power to stop the fighting, to secure peace,